Who were the Pharisees and what did they really teach? Throughout history, few groups have been as misunderstood as the Pharisees mentioned in the New Testament, primarily due to their opposition to Jesus. They are often remembered for conflicts and controversies. But who were the Pharisees really? Before we continue, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so. And if you're already a subscriber, give us a like to receive notifications about more videos. Moving on, who were these men who played such a significant role in the intertestamental period, the New Testament, and the formation of Rabbinic Judaism? How did they live and what did they teach to the point of being severely condemned by Jesus? Were all Pharisees the same and deserving of the bad reputation they generally have? Many people talk about the Pharisees, but not everyone fully understands the nature of this group. In this video, you will gain a better understanding of the true history of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were members of a faction within the Jewish community, whose activities are highlighted in the New Testament, particularly due to their significant opposition to the ministry of Jesus Christ. They represented one of the three main groups among the Jews, alongside the Sadducees and the Essenes. However, before we delve into the history of the Pharisees, we need to understand why this group came to be known by this name. Pharisee might derive from the Hebrew verb meaning to separate or divide. If this is correct, the term Pharisee conveys the idea of separation or distinction, and perhaps this group became known in this way because people started to view its members as separatists. The question that arises is, separated from what? Undoubtedly, the Pharisees sought to distance themselves from certain practices, influences, or other groups. However, it is not possible to definitively state the exact nature of this separation reflected in the group's name. Some argue that it refers to a separation from impurities and worldly customs, while others suggest that the term might have a more historical application, such as a political stance or a distinction in specific practices and beliefs. Historically, the Pharisees did distance themselves from various things, such as the Hasmonean dynasty, which controlled Judea during the intertestamental period. They also distanced themselves from the rapidly advancing Greek cultural assimilation and, primarily, from Jews who did not care much for the commandments and Mosaic law. Another possibility for the separation indicated by the term Pharisee might be a particularly interpretative aspect of the scriptures. In this sense, the term Pharisee could initially refer to an exceptional skill in interpretation and exegesis demonstrated by this group, reinforcing the image of the Pharisees as rigorous interpreters of the law. But you should also know that some scholars reject the meaning of the term Pharisee as derived from the Hebrew verb to separate, and instead assert that its root is in the Aramaic word for Persian. For these scholars, the similarities between some doctrines of Phariseeism and Zoroastrianism, which was the religion of Persia, suggest that the Pharisees were nicknamed Persianizers. This could explain the doctrinal animosity between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who primarily represented the Jewish aristocracy and priestly leadership. The origin of the Pharisees is a point of debate. Some argue that the Pharisees may have emerged during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah as those who rejected the pagan customs adopted by the Jews after the Babylonian exile. Others think they might have emerged among the scribes who aimed to continue Ezra's work in studying and strictly observing the law. The most likely position is that the Pharisees emerged in the period preceding the Maccabean War, aiming to resist and oppose Hellenistic customs through strict observance of the Mosaic law. Thus, the righteous ones or pious men who led the resistance to Hellenization in the 1st century BCE were probably the precursors of the Pharisees. These individuals, fervently devoted to their covenant with the Lord, opposed attempts by Antiochus Epiphanes to impose Greek customs on the Jews, culminating in support for the Maccabean revolt. Over time, after the rededication of the temple and the achievement of religious freedom, the righteous ones began to distance themselves from the political complications involving the Hasmoneans, the group that led the revolt. They wanted to focus more on religious life and less on politics. From this separation emerged several Jewish sects, including the Pharisees, who continued the legacy of the righteous ones. dedicating themselves to interpreting and living according to Jewish laws and traditions. The Pharisees distinguished themselves not only by their rigorous religious practices, but also by their critical stance toward the growing politicization of Jewish leaders at the time. The Pharisees are first mentioned by the historian Flavius Josephus, who described them alongside the Sadducees and Essenes as groups with different interpretations and doctrines in first-century Judaism. It is interesting to note that John the Baptist, a Jewish leader, despite initially being close to the Pharisees, separated from them after an incident during a banquet when a man suggested he was unworthy of the high priesthood. This episode marked the beginning of a period of tension and conflict between the Pharisees and the Jewish political leadership, which began to favor the Sadducees during the reigns of Aristobulus I and Alexander Jannaeus, the sons of John Hyrcanus. Despite these adversities, the Pharisees maintained significant influence among the common people, likely due to their dedication to Jewish traditions and law. This influence continued to grow, especially under the rule of Alexandra, wife of Jannaeus, who saw in aligning with the Pharisees a way to stabilize her government. Thus, the Pharisees achieved a prominent position, controlling political and religious decisions of the time. However, with Alexandra's death and the power struggle between her two sons, Hyrcanus I and Aristobulus I, the Pharisees saw their political prestige decline, especially when the throne was secured by Aristobulus I, who was supported by the Sadducees. Even so, the Pharisees maintained their relevance among the people, despite constant political changes and increasing Roman pressure. Even Herod, a later ruler who had no regard for Pharisaic teachings, recognized the importance of maintaining a cautious relationship with them due to their power and popular influence. Unlike the Sadducees, who were predominantly aristocrats, most Pharisees were merchants and traders committed to strict observance of the Jewish law. The Pharisees distinguished themselves from the common people by their strict adherence to legal traditions. Although most did not have formal education in the interpretation of the law, this commitment to religious practices led lay Pharisees to seek guidance from scribes, who were professional interpreters of legal matters. Among the Pharisees, there were also priests and Levites, though in smaller numbers. The basic organization of the Pharisees occurred in closed communities. The Pharisees formed distinct groups, often located around Jerusalem, which reinforced their influence. Admission to these communities was strictly controlled, requiring candidates to commit to the complex and rigid Pharisaic laws, including tithing practices, purification ceremonies, and special diets. Candidates were even subjected to a period of evaluation before becoming full members of the community, assuming all associated responsibilities and privileges. The leadership of these communities was entrusted to a scribe responsible for the authoritative interpretation of the law and possibly others. These groups not only provided a space for debate and mutual support, but also organized regular worship, especially on Sabbath evenings, which included Torah study and communal meals. Besides the closed communities, the Pharisees exerted broader influence through synagogues, which served as centers for Torah teaching and charitable activities. This involvement allowed Pharisaic ideas to reach a significant portion of the Jewish population, many of whom sympathized with their views without necessarily becoming formal members of the communities. The Pharisees were known for their strict observance not only of the written law, but also of the oral tradition. For them, the oral law, which they claimed had been preserved from generation to generation by notable men, from Ezra and before him the ancient prophets Joshua, and ultimately tracing back to Moses, needed to be observed rigorously. They honored it as much as the written law. This was the main characteristic that set the Pharisees apart from other Jewish sects that also had zeal for the written law.